Hey guys, so today I want to show you how to paint a landscape from a photograph. If you've been watching my other videos about painting landscapes, I did some imaginary ones where I showed you the fundamentals of putting all the elements together. But in this video, I want to show you the difference between a photograph of a landscape and creating a painting of one. So I'll be using the same methods as I did with my other videos, and so if you guys are familiar with my other videos, I'll be pretty much doing the same techniques. But if you guys do have any trouble at any time with any of the things that I'm doing, I did leave links in the description below for my other videos that go way more into depth about how to paint each specific element of the landscape. I'll be using acrylic paints for the sake of the speed of the painting, but you can still use oil paints if you want to, but it's just going to take more time obviously because they dry slower. Anyways, let's get started. So I start off like I do with any other painting. I have some light brown underpainting, and then I start to add all the basic shapes and colors. If you have a large amount of items in an area, just get the overall average color of the area and use that when you're doing the preliminary work. This landscape has a lot of potential detail we can paint if we choose to, but since we do have limited space on this canvas, we're going to have to forego doing hyper-realism and go the traditional route. So the more I keep painting here, the smaller the items are going to get as I continue blocking everything in. You can start to see the formations of a waterfall in the background, along with a few rocks and a river here below. So you can see on this left side, I'm starting to paint more local shapes. Besides the basic formations of the waterfall, we have some vegetation going on here. Even though we are still blocking some things in here, pay attention to where you lay them out. I'm using a simple grid that helps match the painting to the reference photo. Also, as you continue to add more of these basic shapes on here, pay attention to the overall structure of them. Where does the bottom of the plant start? Where do they end? Start to get an idea of the painting. Really place yourself in that photo and understand where you are so you kind of get a three-dimensional concept of it. Notice where the bright sunlit parts are. Notice where the dark shadowy parts are. Add the basic overall dark and light values of that area. What helps a lot is to squint at the photo where the image gets blurry, and that way you can get a so-called average color of that area. I'm not yet adding all that detail yet, but you can start to see how the building blocks of this painting are coming together. So before we start going deeper into this painting, let's check out this area first. Notice how all these leaves have so many layers upon layers. Not just that, but lots of different color values ranging from really dark to really bright. What we are going to do is start painting the layer from the very back and work our way towards the layers that are closest to us. So now I start to paint some leaf clusters around these trees. I'm using a slightly desaturated green color since I don't want these colors to stand out that much. The further something is away from the viewer, the less color it's going to have. This is also one difference between the photograph and the painting. The photo has color saturation that is pretty close together, but in a painting we want to exaggerate the range of desaturation in order to separate the layers even further. I'm using a small round brush, carefully placing them here, and also am slightly blending them together as well as with the background. One thing you'll notice me doing a lot in this video, which I talk about in other ones, is the concept of dry brushing. This technique helps a great deal with acrylics due to their fast drying nature. When you paint leaves or many other things in nature, the way I like to do things is blend some of them partially along with the background or previous layer, but some other random ones I leave alone and paint them in a more precise manner. Also, remember that these leaves are the ones furthest away. Painting leaves in a landscape involves layering, where we will be stacking multiple layers of color and value on top of each other to sculpt together that full and rich leaf formation. So after I paint some of these leaves, I take a break from them and move on to something else. I'm starting to add more detail to the rocks that make up that waterfall here in the back. I'm still paying attention to the reference photo and matching the basic shapes. It's a good idea to take breaks frequently when you're painting something specific because it does help rest your eyes. Even though you're not doing any physical labor when you're painting, you are still exercising your mind, and it does use a good deal of energy when you're concentrating on something. So right now I'm kind of going in different areas around the section, filling in more and more of these spots with the smaller shapes, objects, and color values that take up that space. When you're still at the stage where you're blocking in the paint, you'll find yourself going all over the place to fill in the canvas with the proper objects. Let's do some work on the right side. This space has lots of green leaves going all over the place, some of them illuminated by the bright sunlight, and some of them obscured by shadow to varying degrees. These bright yellow shapes I'm painting are just one of the layers that will be added on here. I'm not too concerned about their shape just yet, because later on I'll do more blending over here. Then I do some more work with the background here. Notice how I'm using more of a bluish green color here than what the reference photo has provided. This bluish tone helps exaggerate the difference between the background and the clusters of plants in front of it. It helps make the painting's color range look more dynamic, as well as providing a good sense of separation between these elements I'm painting. I'm also painting the separation between the trees and the background. I break down the tree leaf clusters into these shapes for right now, but later on we'll break them down even further when I add more detail. Then I add some dark green chunks of paint here, which I'll also blend later on. This part of the reference photo has a vast amount of layers of leaves, and the way to simulate that in a painting is to use a variety of color, value, brushing motion, and continuing to use layers where you can partially see the previous one. Now let's go back to the left side here and work on the leaves that reflect the sunlight. These will be the brightest ones, so I'll be using a combination of yellow, white, and a small amount of green. I'll be painting these the same way as the other ones, doing a mix of blending some of them and keeping some of the other ones sharpened. When you have a bright sunlit area like this, you're going to have a more dynamic range of contrast and color, so it's going to take more effort to balance out the idea of blending some of the objects as well as retaining that fine definition. The way the sunlight goes inside these tree leaf clusters is going to be in a way such that we'll have multiple layers of leaves stacked on top of one another. So after I finish painting this part, I'll come back later and add some darker shades of color. Now I work more on this area here where you can start to tell that we have a shaded area where we'll have a stark contrast between the sunlit area and this part. When you are painting a relatively darker area like this, pay careful attention to the range of values because you're still going to be using a variety of dark and lighter shades of green, just to a lesser degree. I'm continuing to add more leaves and texture to any solid areas I see. This section of the landscape will have lots of small objects clustered together, so as you're continuing to block in these objects, you'll be going smaller and smaller in your region of painting, and will need to focus more on being deliberate with your brushing. I'm painting some really dark spots here where the shadows are going to be the most intense, where later on I'll be adding some more foliage that will emerge from these places. I'm starting to fill in the solid areas in this painting, adding leaves and vegetation in any areas that have too much of a solid color. That's the mistake I see many new artists make, where they can add more color variety, texture, or traces of different vegetation. But instead they leave the spaces alone and allow that area looking monotone and flat without much creativity. Now I'm adding more texture to the rocks. If you have any trouble painting rocks, I left a link for my video on how to paint them. In the reference photo, we have a huge cluster of small rocks here that looks difficult to match. If we did use a larger canvas, we could go deep and paint much more detail, but when you are making a smaller painting, it's much easier to simplify it by making the shapes more general. Using color variety and texture helps make these rock formations look more complex and helps create the illusion that there's more of them. I'm painting the initial layers for right now on these rock textures. I'll come back later and finish adding more detail. For now, I'm going to work on the waterfall and the background rock formations. The darker parts of the waterfall are going to have a desaturated aquamarine color. Use small brush strokes and blend some of them together using the dry brushing method we have been using with the leaves. So this cliff in the background is going to have less contrast than the rocks we have just painted. Since it's in the background, we want to have it so that the color values don't stand out nor draw too much attention. Right now, I'm just doing some basic texturing of this cliff surface. There are some plants that are growing here that I'll be adding later on. As you paint this cliff, pay careful attention to the color values, as they will be closer in range than the rocks in the river because this cliff is one of the furthest objects in this painting. I like to alternate values by starting with a neutral value, then go dark, then go light, and then I continue alternating between light and dark until I sculpt the rock surface to its final form. In my rock painting video, I go way more into depth about it, so I highly advise you check it out. So anyways, I'm going to take a break from this and move on to something else. I add another layer of white paint onto the waterfall. Not too much paint, but just enough to continue to add to the fullness of the color over here. Make sure to use very small brushing here, as this part will have water mist and small chunks of water coming down. Now let's go back to working on these leaves. I continue to add layers over these yellow leaves, where we have sunlight inside this area as well as the leaves that are not lit up. This is a slow process, so take your time and resist the temptation of painting too large of brush strokes. Pay attention to any areas that have any solid color and continue adding textures to it with different shades of green. Another thing to pay attention to is the general trend of color value. Some areas are going to have gradual shifts of value, like the shadowy part here, So make sure that as you paint these small chunks of leaves, keep changing your color value so that this large group of leaves creates a smooth transition. So let's work on this grassy patch down here. Sometimes when you look at the reference photo, you're going to have a limited amount of information to work with. In times like these, we need to rely on our imagination as well as some techniques. Since we are painting the ground that contains grass as well as assuming some leaves since we are in a forest, we're going to use a range of colors here. Last time we have established a little bit of texture, so now let's paint some clusters of fallen tree leaves here. I'm using a desaturated orange color here, using small brushing just like before. Pay attention to how much you paint here because we want to preserve some of the previous layers. Now I switch to an olive green type of color. I'm just adding more of the same thing here, just chunks of paint. When you are in doubt of what to paint, use color variety and texture. These two elements of painting really help with filling in the gaps. So now you can start to see how this part looks like how the ground would appear in a forest. Now I switch to a light brown or tan color and paint some miscellaneous rocks that are embedded inside the grassy area. When you are painting a landscape, be aware of how much stuff there really is inside every area you paint. You've got different types of grass, vegetation, rocks poking out of the earth, and the different angles that the ground slopes up and down. The layers of color here are starting to get thick, showing a better texture of the area. I'll come back here later once again to add the final highlights where the sun reflects on the brightest parts of the surface area. Okay, so now let's go back once again to add some more leaves. This time let's add some really dark ones on a few areas. Don't be afraid to add contrast here. I see new painters holding back on adding a strong contrast between light and dark values. And so here I want to show you that it just takes accuracy and careful painting where you don't rush the process. So now I go back to the right and elaborate more on a few miscellaneous items. I add some more surface area to the cliff here, and I add some more variety of green color on the forested area. You can start to see how this painting is coming along. We have a good amount of things established, and you can see how all this layering we have been doing is creating this landscape. I'm spending some time thickening the tree trunks and adding some small branches here as well. One thing to remember is that these tree trunks and branches will be inside all of these clusters of leaves. You could paint over some of the leaves if you want. Remember, it's all about layering and stacking them on top of one another to create a thicker overall layer of paint to make the landscape rich with color and detail. Also, when it comes to painting the lighter side of the tree trunk, leave some of them dark because many of them are going to be obscured by the shadows inside all those leaf clusters. I come back here to the leaves and add more thickness to these leaf clusters. I'm using a slightly different hue of green, this one a more olive tone. I'm doing the same brushing as I've been doing before. Small brush strokes where I blend some of them in, and some of them I leave alone to be sharper. I hope you're getting the hang of this by now. It's basically a few simple techniques and just lots of meticulous work. The great thing about this is that since this is a landscape painting, you're not really restricted that much with what you have to exactly paint on here, as opposed to a portrait or skyline where your brushing has to be more precise. Landscape paintings are both figuratively and literally more organic, so you have a larger margin of error. I continue adding more texture here, adding a few more slightly darker spots because I did notice the area looking a little flat, so that's just another thing to look out for. In addition to adding texture, make sure your item doesn't look too flat when it's meant to be a three-dimensional object. I then add some highlights here, just some random light tan flowers over everything, as well as some brighter leaves in the bushes next to the waterfall. This section of the painting is really coming together, almost as if it looks like it's finished. But that would be too soon now, wouldn't it? Now I'm continuing once again adding more layers of leaves all over the place. Also, a very important point I have to make. As you stack more layers and color values of varying sorts, it's also important to have variety because this way it separates the layers more so that you can have a more rich and vibrant landscape. Stacking multiple layers of color and value is pointless if they all look the same. Now here's something interesting I'm doing. I'm adding some random red flower patches here, just to add some more variety. This is one way to combat the limited space that the canvas has to offer. When you are painting from a complex photo like this, we have to compensate with being more creative and providing the viewer more interesting objects and color to behold. This is kind of where we have a license for more creativity in this scenario. That's another example of exaggerating something from a photograph. So now I'm going back to these rocks. There's a section of rocks here that has this narrow strip of sunlight coming across it. And so here I want to make sure that they are the brightest ones out of all of them. I'm adding more texture to these rocks, slowly building up the layers of color and value. Just like I've been painting with the leaves, I'm leaving some of the previous layers visible and using some color variety to make sure that the rocks look more solid. Besides adding texture and shape to these rocks, pay attention to which ones have more sunlight on them. Some will stand out more than others. Also, pay attention to the consistency of your values. The textures on the sunlit rocks should be generally lighter than the textures on the darker rocks, although occasionally you can make an exception. Okay, let's paint some water. I'm using a desaturated aquamarine color here, and once again I am adding texture. There's a lot of splashing and mist inside this area around the rocks, and from looking at the reference photo, it's difficult to discern what exactly to paint. Simplify the shapes in the beginning, and as we continue painting this, then you could add more intricacies to this area. I alternate color values here, using the dark and light version of this aquamarine mixture, layering the paint over each other. Also, use horizontal brushing in this situation, because the water surface is obviously flat. Blend in some of these ripples together, but also leave some of them alone because there is a lot of splashing and clusters of water droplets in some places. So as I go more to the right towards the waterfall, the water is going to get much brighter. I'm using pure white paint here to add more contrast to this area, and then later on I will blend it together where it meets the darker section. I'm also adding a few highlights in these darker areas. Use these bright colors sparingly so that we can retain a strong contrast between this section and the brighter part of the river. I then go back and work some more on these rock textures. Notice how this river is starting to come together, even with the small amount of work that we just did. Painting a landscape really is just about repetition, doing many of the same things over and over again until it finally comes together. I'm coming back to work in the cliff area here, and there's still much work to do. I'm continuing to add more texture and depth to this part, making sure I stay consistent with my limited range of contrast. Another thing I want to point out real quick is that I modified the color value of that shadow in the trees above. It was too dark for that part because I want to exaggerate the distance of it, since that's what we are doing in this painting. Now I'm adding more volume to the waterfall. At first I didn't add enough size to the shape of this waterfall, so I'm doing that right now. I continue to add texture to it as well, giving it a sense of fullness that makes it stand out from everything else in the background. I spent some time painting some of the really small water droplets coming off the side of it, so make sure to pay attention to details like that. Now I'm going back to these leaf areas and adding some negative space in between these clusters. I'm using white paint again, but this time being careful to gently place it in between these areas because I want to very gently dry brush this color into the surrounding leaf clusters so that it kind of creates this glowing effect. This is another difference between the photograph and a painting of a landscape. This type of exaggeration brings the painting to life, giving it a more epic feel to it. It also helps smooth out any rough looking areas, giving it a more polished appearance. So we are coming towards the end of this first video of painting this landscape. In part 2, we will continue working on this painting, finishing off this section and then elaborating more on the rest of it. The other parts of this painting will be further explained in the next video, so stay tuned for part 2. I hope this video helped, and if it did, please hit the like button, and if you haven't already, subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.